I'm going to go now into the study and lay a little groundwork first. Okay, we've had taxation with the 16th Amendment in 1914. My goodness, what happened in 1917? First World War? Sure did. Okay. Well, it was around that time that Wilson wanted to form the League of Nations. And in my archives, I've got the quotation that how sad he felt because he had helped to pass the Federal Reserve Act. Now, the Federal Reserve Act, there were 6 individuals that represented, get this now, 1/4 of the world's entire wealth, that got together and decided that our economy needed to be regulated so that we wouldn't have the run on the banks like we did in 1908. By the way, the Depression in 1908, 1918, far worse than the crash of '29. But you see, the Federal Reserve was in power then, and they held that money back and held it back until you had the Depression. And so the natural market forces were not allowed to act. You've got United Nations, and I mentioned before the NGO, the NEA, and the Rockefeller Institute. You got the prayer removed out of the schools in the 60s. You've got denial of, all of a sudden our public schools are federal property, and let's see, we the government of the people, by the people, for the people. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Wait a minute, in the last part of that paragraph it talks about that they can only govern us by our consent. By our consent. Well, we're not witnessing that today. In fact, they're just blowing us off. Okay, so you've got the dumbing down of our kids. You've got the removal of God basically out of the schools. You've got, and I'm calling this from the 60s until now, just like you've heard the Cold War era. I call this the era of perfidy. Perfidy is a word that came into existence in 1529, and it means, and it was used by our founding fathers to describe the conditions that led them to where they were going. It means unfaithful, disloyal, acts of which are the personification of treachery. I go further to say that if you're an elected representative and you're perfidious, that treason can be labeled along with you. Folks, we're living in a time of fear, but you live under a different kind of fear. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. In Proverbs 29:25, it says, "The fear of man bringeth a snare. But if you put your trust in the Lord, you'll be safe." What's happening with our country now, as has happened in other countries, when the church is involved, is that it becomes more and more of a man government rather than the God-given government that is in the Bible, well established. And so it was in 1993 when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, I'm going to go ahead and start to get into this, that I was sitting in the fall of it's October 93, reading Conservative Chronicle, Pat Buchanan. And it was on, he was doing an article on an item called Presidential Decision Directive 13, which later, after going back through the State Department, became Presidential Decision Directive 25. What this did under the Clinton administration is it allowed the Commander-in-Chief to place any unit of armed forces under the direct operational control of United Nations appointed officers and non-commissioned officers in the field. All right. At the same time, referring back to an article I read in USA Today, March 11th, page 2, our president, in less than 60 days after he was inaugurated, made the following quotation. Oh, and understand Article 2 of the Constitution has one word in that oath that you won't find in other oaths, and that's the word preserve. To the best of his ability. So here we go. March 11th, 1993. We cannot be so fixated on our desire to preserve the rights of ordinary Americans to legitimately own handguns and rifles that we can't think about reality. My feeling at the time was on March 12th, the Supreme Court Justice that gave the inauguration address and oath to President Clinton should have called for his impeachment. I don't know how much further you can go in being perfidious. That is total, that's in your face, you ordinary Americans, which I used to get upset over that. But when you read history, you find that ordinary Americans have done extraordinary things. Have they not? All right. So, is that better? Okay. Moving right along. How much time do I have? 2 hours. So what really concerned me is here we are in April of 1994. You had a helicopter containing several soldiers that got shot down over Iraq. Vice President Gore made the statement that these Americans died in the service of the United Nations. So you've got that aspect. I was concerned about Posse Comitatus Act. We had the Waco incident where Janet Reno, as Attorney General, sent in active duty personnel. So we're talking Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 being violated here. Well, it was President Bush in May of 1992 that sent 4,000 Army and Marine Corps personnel, 4,000, and stationed them just outside the city limits of Los Angeles during the Rodney King trials. Most recently, during the holiday period, not this one, the December area, I found it ironic that San Bernardino County was given the services for the entire holiday period of a number, I believe it was a platoon size level, of United States Marines who were stationed at 29 Palms. That's why I found it ironic. 29 Palms is the home of the United States Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Training Center. And I specifically chose them, and I chose 300 Marines as the population size. They had to be males. They had to be combat trained. If they had any other service actively, like Somalia was going on at the time, then that was fine. Some did, some didn't. But I didn't want the opinion of just some clerk or nothing against the Air Force, but the thing is, as we look at our proud history, with the Marine Corps history, the proud, the few, the proud, the Marines, knowing that they'll follow orders and they'll fight to the death. So that was my population. But I wanted to find out for myself, here in 1994, what was the mindset of these Marines with respect to their oath of office, the Constitution, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, following legal orders or illegal orders, or as they're called, unlawful orders, whether or not they knew the difference. So I set up a lot of scenarios, three mainly. U.S. command on U.S. soil, U.S. command on foreign soil, UN command on foreign soil. And some of the